The NFL season is just about to start, and in case you've been in a coma or just not paying attention, in today's video I will recap everything that you need to know that happened in the offseason. Probably the most significant thing is Tom Brady actually retired this year. So I know the previous year Tom Brady said he was going to retire, then he did a little switcheroo and played anyways. He wasn't that great last year, so he actually retired now. And he wasn't the only one. JJ Watt and likely Matt Ryan have also retired. And while I'm talking about old quarterbacks, have to bring up Aaron Rodgers, of course. So he went into a darkness retreat. He didn't know what he was going to do. He might retire, he might not. And the darkness told him to stay. But the darkness also told him to go to New York, be with the Jets, and follow Brett Favre's career. But unfortunately for Aaron, he was still under contract with the Packers. Aaron just pretty much said, I only want to play for the Jets, and the Packers were like, I still need some picks for you. So essentially what ended up happening, for the most part, is the Jets gave up the second round pick this year and a conditional second round pick next year that could turn into a first if Aaron Rodgers plays in 65% of the snaps this year. So pretty much, unless he gets hurt, it's going to turn into a first. So they gave up a second and a first for Aaron Rodgers. But he has looked pretty good in training camp. He looks young again. He's having fun. He's not the old man anymore. Well, I guess he is the old man. And he has a strong connection with Garrett Wilson, and they could be a pretty legitimate threat. However, he is in probably the most stacked division in the NFL, with the Bills, who are always good, and the Dolphins as well. While speaking about the Dolphins, they had some news as well. So first off, Tua, he had those major concussion issues last year. Pretty scary. A lot of people actually thought he might retire, and he said he thought about it. But he wanted to come back, he wanted to play football, make money, have fun. I don't know why, but he said he wanted to come back. And he spent all offseason working out and learning how to fall. So, sounds a bit silly, but he used to fall by just smacking his head on the ground, and now he actually does a little roll. So, probably works out better for him. The Dolphins also traded their third round pick to the Rams for Jalen Ramsey, so it seems like the Dolphins are really trying to compete while they have Tua on a cheap contract, and they have those explosive wide receivers and a lot of talent on the defense. Although, even with all this talent, I don't think they can compete with the Jets or the Bills. And speaking of cheap quarterbacks, these teams no longer have them. Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and Justin Herbert have all been signed to long-term contracts, all making about $50 million per year. So they're no longer on the rookie contracts, unlike Tua. And then while speaking of teams that have a great roster and an iffy quarterback, but even more to the extreme, the 49ers have got rid of their backup quarterbacks, essentially. They just decided to trade Trey Lance to the Cowboys for a 4th round pick. And this signals a complete failure of an experiment, with one of the worst trades ever, trading 3 first-round picks for Trey Lance, and then he only starts in a handful of games and throws about 100 total passes in his career there. But luckily, they struck gold with Brock Purdy. Maybe, I'm not sold on him, but the rest of the team is so good that they're still a legitimate threat to make the Super Bowl. And on the other hand, with Jimmy G, he went to sign with the Raiders, signed a pretty reasonable deal, and he has Josh Jacobs and Devontae Adams there to work with. They'll probably be a terrible team, but, maybe they'll work their way up to about 500 and just be in no man's land. Because, let's face it, they're not going to beat the Chiefs. They're not going to beat the Chargers. They might make a wild card, but even then they're not going to win a playoff game. So it seems like they're just trying to be okay. They're not going to be great, and maybe they'll sell some tickets in their new stadium. And if you're thinking, oh, I remember the Raiders, they have an average quarterback, you're probably thinking of the old one, Derek Carr, who just went to the Saints, and he's made the Saints also okay. Probably a little bit better than the Raiders are, but fortunately for the Saints, they're in the NFC South, which is the worst division in football, so they could really likely make the playoffs going 9-8 or so. The Cowboys also went all in by trading for Stephon Gilmore and Brandon Cooks, 2 kind of old guys who still might have 1 or 2 good years left, and they traded several mid-round picks for them. But this could bring their team over the top in a weak NFC, although of course they're going to probably lose to the Eagles, but the wild card spot is wide open. Then in the NFL draft, there was a lot of drama, as always. So to start it off, you have to remember back to last year, the Texans had a stranglehold on the number 1 overall pick, and Lovie Smith and the Texans players were like, you know what, I don't care about that pick, I'm gonna win games. But unfortunately, they only started trying to win games the past 3 or so games in the season, so they ended up 3-13-1 and got the number 2 overall pick. But it gets even worse because they won the last game of the year by scoring a touchdown with 50 seconds left and then going for 2. So that moved them all the way from the number 1 to the number 2 pick. This allowed the Bears to get hold of the number 1 overall pick, and the Bears are like, hey, I already have a quarterback that I sort of believe in Fields, but he doesn't have any weapons, and I'll just trade it. So the Panthers traded 2 firsts, 2 seconds, and DJ Moore, a star wide receiver, to the Bears to move up to the number 1 slot to draft Bryce Young. So this could have easily cost the Texans their preferred quarterback. Now, of course, they are saying that, they wanted CJ Stroud anyway. They didn't want Bryce Young, but do you really believe them? I don't know. It's a bit iffy. They are both solid candidates for franchise quarterbacks and completely unproven as they are rookies. But with the number 2 overall pick, the Texans were like, okay, that's fine. I'll take CJ Stroud. Moving on to the 3rd overall pick, we all thought maybe the Cardinals would trade their pick so someone would get Anthony Richardson, and then they did trade their pick. However, it was to the Texans. And the Texans traded 2 firsts, a 2nd, and a 3rd round pick to move up to the number 3 overall slot, and the Texans were able to select what they believed to be the best defensive player in the draft. And then finally, the Colts ended up with Anthony Richardson. And all 3 of these quarterbacks have looked decent in the preseason. Of course, it is the preseason, but they will all actually start the year off starting in week 1. So thankfully, there's no sitting behind a bad starter on the bench. The rookies are just going to start the year, the entire year. They'll make all their mistakes and hopefully they'll grow. But one interesting thing this has done is it has given the Cardinals the 2 best chances at getting the number 1 overall pick next year. The Cardinals have their own pick, and they're projected to be the worst team in the NFL, and they have the Texans pick next year, who are projected to be the 2nd worst team in the NFL. So they have 2 really good looking chances at getting the number 1 pick in next year's draft to draft potentially Caleb Wilson. Or if they don't want to draft him, they could trade it for a lot because he's seen as a generational prospect. If you've made it this far into the video, please consider subscribing to my channel and leaving a like down below. But back to the video. Then the biggest news that happened in the NFL offseason is the entire running back drama. So it centers around running backs not making as much as other players. And it is pretty bad. Cole Kmet, an average tight end on the Bears, gets more than almost every single running back in the NFL. So it is pretty bad. But that doesn't mean teams are going to change what they're doing. So to start it out, Josh Jacobs and Saquon Barkley were both franchise tagged, and they both wanted a long-term contract. The team said no, so they held out for a little bit. They had a little powwow with all the running backs and said, we need to change, but we don't exactly know what to do. Eventually, Josh Jacobs and Saquon Barkley didn't sign a franchise tag, but signed a 1-year contract that gave them $1 or $2 million more than the franchise tag. So essentially, they got nothing done. They didn't get a long-term deal, and the team can still franchise tag him next year. Where it gets interesting is with Jonathan Taylor. So he was not franchised. He's still on his rookie contract, and he was holding in, I guess, because he showed up to every practice and wanting a new contract. And then he had a huge argument with the owner on Twitter. His agent was involved. All this explosive stuff. Looks really weird for a running back arguing with an owner. And he essentially said, oh, my ankle still hurts from last year, so he's not going to be able to practice. Eventually, the Colts said, oh, you can look for a trade, but the Colts asked for a lot of compensation in return. So he didn't get traded, and he's still on the team. But since he says his ankle hurts and he's not playing, the Colts have placed him on the PUP, which puts you out for a minimum of the first 4 weeks. Although Jonathan Taylor's probably okay with this because, he's not going to get hurt. and as long as he plays in 6 games during the year will accrue on his contract, and he will be free from his contract going into next year. Although he could, of course, get franchise tagged. I think a lot of people expect him to get traded at some point this year, but no one really knows. So that's the biggest mess in the NFL, and has ruined several fantasy football teams already. And then finally, there are 2 major players that might be holding out for part of or most of the NFL season. The first one is Nick Bosa on the 49ers, so he is pretty likely to play. The team thinks he might not even miss week 1, even though it's only a few days away, and that they can really bridge some ground and find a deal that works for both people. You know, another groundbreaking record-setting deal, and they feel fairly confident. Now, on the other hand, Chris Jones of the Chiefs. So if you don't know him, he's the best defensive tackle in the NFL. He's better than Aaron Donald at this point. And he also wants a new deal. And unlike Bosa, Chris Jones has said on Twitter that he is willing to miss a large portion of the year. And with the first game right around the corner, it is highly likely that he will at least miss week 1, and I wouldn't be surprised if he misses half of the season like he said he would. So that would be a huge blow to the Chiefs, because behind Patrick Mahomes, he's their best player. You might not have heard of him because he's a defensive tackle, but he is their second best player and one of the best players in the NFL. So thanks for watching my video. Subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, and bye.